I have attended the Hartwood Hall Spring Dinner every year for 22 years, and I will tell you honestly that before last April I could not have named a single piece of music ever played there. The evenings were pleasant. The wine was adequate. The conversation ran along its usual grooves: drainage disputes, planning applications, who had sold which field and at what price, and I returned home each year with a pleasant, forgettable warmth. Last April I drove home in silence and could not account for a single mile of the road. My name is Leonard Ashby. I am 72 years old, a retired country solicitor, and I have spent 44 years reading land titles, codicils, and the small print sorrows of other people's lives. I am not a musical man. My late wife was fond of the radio, I was fond of her being fond of it. That is the extent of my education on the subject. I mention this because what I am about to describe is not the account of an expert. It is the account of a man who was standing in a room when something happened to it, and who has been trying to find the right words ever since. The dinner was held, as always, in the long drawing room of the hall, with the French windows opened onto the garden where the evening was just cool enough to be pleasant. Sir James Hartwood had put on his usual spread, 40-odd guests, circular tables, a menu printed on card, and had arranged for a visiting musician to provide the evening's interest. This year the musician was a man called Roland Fitch. I was told he was celebrated. He had the manner of a man who had been told this many times and found it entirely accurate. He moved through the pre-dinner drinks with the particular assurance of someone who considers a room improved by his presence in it, and he spoke loudly and well about the debasement of musical education and the general decline in public taste. The Bosendorfer stood in the alcove at the far end of the room, as it always does. In 22 years I had never heard it played. It sat there under its lid like a piece of inherited furniture, present, significant, and entirely ignored. Sir James had mentioned once that his grandmother had played. The grandmother had been dead for 40 years, the piano had been silent for approximately as long. Ezra Toll arrived at 7:30. Ezra is the head groundskeeper at Hartwood, or was, technically, though he had been on a lighter arrangement since his knee gave out 2 winters before. He is a broad, weathered man of perhaps 68, with hands the size of dinner plates and a face that has been outside in all weathers for 50 years without complaint. He wore his waxed coat, as always, and his boots were the boots of a man who had been doing something practical. I had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times over the years. At the edges of these evenings, I found him a man of very few words, most of which were accurate. He appeared in the drawing-room doorway with his hat in his hand and a small girl beside him. She was perhaps 7 years old. Possibly younger. She wore a wool dress that had dried unevenly, and her boots, as small, scuffed, the laces redone in mismatched knots, were still damp at the toes. There was mud along the hem of her dress and a faint tittle-line of dried rain along her jaw, the way children get when they have been properly soaked and then improperly dried. She had very dark eyes and the particular stillness of a child who has learned not to take up too much space. Ezra spoke quietly to Sir James near the door. She had been found sheltering in the gatehouse out of the rain. Her father worked the seasonal labor at Fenwick's farm, 2 miles down the road. No one was answering the number Ezra had for them. He had driven her up to the hall because the gatehouse had no heat worth mentioning and the evening had turned cold. He was sorry to bring her in. He would keep her out of the way. Sir James said of course, there was plenty of food. His wife Ellen produced a bread roll and a glass of juice, and Ada, I learned her name later, from Ezra, in the car park, accepted both with a polite gravity that suggested she was quite used to managing herself in rooms full of strangers. Ezra settled her at a small chair near the window and went to stand at the edge of the room in the posture of a man who does not intend to cause trouble. He was not invisible, he was the largest person in the room, but he had the quality of stillness that very self-contained people have, and after a few minutes the room accepted him and moved on. For a while, Ada sat quietly with her bread roll and looked at the garden through the French windows. And then, gradually, she became aware of the piano. I could not have said exactly when it happened. One moment she was looking at the garden, the next, Her attention had shifted, and she was looking at the Bosendorfer the way you look at something you recognize from a long way off. She slid down from her chair without hurry, crossed the room in her damp boots, and stood in front of it. She did not touch it at first. She looked at the closed lid for a long moment, and then, with a careful, almost reverent gesture, she placed both palms flat on the polished wood, not pressing the keys, simply resting her hands on the lid, as though listening through it. Roland Fitch was perhaps 10 feet away when he noticed. He had been mid-sentence to a woman who collected art. He did not finish it. He looked at the child, the mud on her boots, the damp dress, the small hands on his instrument, and then, with the slow precision of a man setting down a weapon, he turned to address the room. "Well," he said pleasantly. His voice carried, people nearby turned. "It seems we have a musician among us." He gestured at Ada with a wide, theatrical smile. "Go on then. Play us something simple. Since you're so fond of touching it." There was a ripple of laughter, not cruel, quite, the gentle, indulgent laughter that adults produce when a child is placed in a mildly absurd situation. Sir James started to say something, and Fitch overrode him with the easy authority of a man who has never been overridden. Ada looked at Fitch. She looked at the piano. She looked at no one in particular. She lifted the lid, sat down, and placed her hands on the keys. No one helped her adjust the bench. She did not ask. She simply sat at whatever height it was and found the keys the way a person finds a door handle in a dark room, not by looking, but by knowing where it is. Her feet did not reach the pedals. She did not seem to notice. The first note fell into the room like a stone into water. It was the opening phrase of Traumerei, Schumann. I was told afterward, I would not have known it. What I knew, standing there with my wine glass suspended halfway to my mouth, was that the room had changed its nature. Not gradually. In an instant, between one breath and the next, something different was happening, and every person present felt it at the same moment, and responded the same way, which was to go very still. The laughter had stopped. Fitch's smile had stopped. He was standing with his hands at his sides in an attitude I had never seen on him, alert, undefended, the professional mask entirely gone, and he was looking at the child's hands with an expression I cannot fully describe. It was something between recognition and bewilderment, the face of a man who has been a student of something his entire life and has just encountered a thing his education has no category for. Ada played without looking at her hands. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing in particular, or perhaps on something interior, some music she was reading from a source none of us could see. Her posture was not a pianist's posture, her wrists were not positioned correctly, she sat with the unschooled uprightness of a child who simply finds it comfortable. None of it mattered. The music that came from under her hands was the music of someone who has heard something so many times, at a register so deep, that it has become part of the architecture of their thinking. She moved through Traumerei without stopping, and then, without a break, into the next piece, and the next. Not performing. Not displaying. Simply continuing, the way a person continues a conversation they have been having for years. I looked at Ezra. He was standing where he had been all evening, hat pressed flat against his chest with both hands. His face is always difficult to read. But he was watching Ada with a particular quality of attention I recognized from 44 years of watching clients in the moment they realize something that alters the shape of what they thought they knew. He was not surprised, exactly. He was reckoning with what he had been carrying without knowing what it was. The woman to my left began to cry quietly, a hand lifted, a small surprised breath, the realization that something had gotten past the usual defenses. Then the man beside her. Then, further along the table, a sound that was not quite a sound so much as a collective release of held breath, the whole room exhaling at once. Ada played on. She was not performing for us. That was the quality that unmade everyone in the room. There was no awareness of an audience in her playing, no desire to produce an effect. She was doing what she did, playing music she carried inside her, on this instrument so much grander than whatever she had learned on that it must have felt like singing in a cathedral after years of singing alone in a field. But she was not overwhelmed. She moved through the pieces with the unhurried authority of someone entirely at home in what they are doing. The last note lasted a long time. She let it stand. Then she put her hands in her lap and looked up, as though she had just remembered where she was. The silence went on for 4 or 5 seconds, perhaps longer. I had lost reliable hold of time. Then the room stood up. Not all at once. It began in ones and twos, people rising with the slightly dazed quality of waking from something, and then quickly the rest of them, until there was no one sitting. Ellen Hartwood was crying openly. Sir James had his hand over his mouth. Roland Fitch stood at the edge of the standing room with his arms at his sides. He did not move for a long moment. He was looking at Ada, who had turned on the bench and was sitting with her feet dangling and her hands folded, watching the room with the patient bewilderment of a child who has done an ordinary thing and cannot understand why everyone is behaving so strangely. Fitch looked at her for a long time. His expression had none of the architecture of his earlier manner, none of the assurance, the well-practiced warmth, the carried certainty. He was simply a man in a room, stripped of everything he had brought into it. He raised his hands. He clapped, once, twice, and then with everyone else, the last to start and the last to stop. He said nothing. I respected that. There was nothing accurate that could have been said. Afterward, in the car park, I asked Ezra about it. He told me in the straightforward way he tells everything. Ada's mother had died the previous November, a brief illness, sudden, the kind that doesn't give a family time to arrange itself. She had left almost nothing. But there was a small wind-up music box, enameled blue, that had sat on Ada's bedside table all her life, and which Ada wound every night before she slept. The melody it played was the same one she had played tonight, though Ezra had not known it had a name. He had found her in the gatehouse that afternoon sitting on the floor with the music box in her lap, not crying, just listening. He had given her a blanket and a biscuit from his tin. He had not asked her anything, because it was clear she did not need questions. He had simply sat with her until the rain got worse, and then brought her up. He had not known she could play. Nobody had. I drove home through 20 miles of dark Oxfordshire lanes and could not afterward name a single feature of the road. What I kept returning to was not Fitch's face, though I will not forget it, and not the music, though the music was extraordinary. It was Ezra in the doorway with his hat pressed to his chest, watching a small girl play a song her mother had left her. He had not known he was carrying anything extraordinary. He had simply done the plainest thing, brought someone small and cold in from the dark, and sat with her, and not asked any questions. You rarely know, when you do that, what it is you are sheltering. But sometimes the room finds out.